Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world. Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm Editor-in-Chief Amy Jones, alongside Senior Editor Robert Lee Brewer and Editor Michael Woodson. Today we have a special guest with us, Writer's Digest University Content Director Sarah Hall. February is the time of year when romance has its heyday, so it seems fitting that for this month's podcast we focus on romance novels. Hey everyone, how are you?
Hello.
Pretty good.
Hello.
Good. So I want to start off with sort of an easy question. What's your relationship with romance novels? Have you always read them? Have you come to them recently? Are you still discovering them?
Well, for me, I'll go ahead and jump in. Thank you so much for having me on today. I started reading romance when I was about 12 years old, stealing it off of my mom's bookshelf, which she, I'm sure, did not know about. And this would have been in the 90s, so it was very classic, lots of princesses and knights who need to protect them, and I loved it immediately. And I definitely read everything that she had, and I remember getting them from the library. And then for several years, I kind of fell out of reading them because my tastes were starting to change, and I didn't feel like what was being published was really to my liking anymore. So for several years, I kind of scratched that itch in the fan fiction community. I read a lot of fan fiction, felt like it was more like what I was enjoying. But then probably within the past 5 years or so, I found myself coming back to the traditionally published world and finding that what was being offered was much more to what I wanted to be reading than it was in the 90s. The industry has changed so much. And so since then, I've kind of rediscovered a love for published original work.
Yeah, and for me, my relationship with romance, I would say that I'm just somebody who tests the waters every once in a while, and I'll read a romance novel if something's kind of blowing up. And I do this with all genres of fiction. If something really starts to blow up, I'll just read it just to get an understanding for what's this thing that everyone is very excited about and is reading, and I just want to kind of understand. So maybe the most recent one that I read was the Duke and I, with the Bridgerton series, when that started to kind of take off on Netflix, I guess a year or two ago. I've done I know I've read Bridget Jones' Diary a long time ago when that was kind of blowing up, same thing. But as far as romance, it's funny, I started thinking about it. I've been surrounded by it ever since I was a little kid, because my grandmother, in her basement where we would all hang out, the rec room, she had this really cool shelf that went all the way around the room, and every single it was just lined with paperbacks, and every single one was either a Western novel or a romance novel, and the old school Harlequin, white cover paperbacks. And I just remember, always being surrounded by it. And of course, as a kid, you hang out with your grandparents, and you just be sitting there and read 15 pages or 20 pages of a random Western or romance, just because you don't have anything else to do. And so in a certain way, I've always been surrounded by it. It's been a big part of growing up and reading in that way.
Oh, yeah, I don't know. I have not read much romance at all. And I think it's because it just completely was not on my radar growing up, or what I was choosing to read growing up. And then Sarah, I think you said it really well. The last 5 years, especially, romance has really taken off in a mainstream way in terms of the publishing world, to the point where once it was happening, I realized I think I've missed something, because people are obviously really hungry for this genre. It can't have just come out of nowhere. It's not a dystopian YA novel blows up and then everyone tries to write dystopian YA novels. It's like, no, romance has been around for a while, and that energy around it is just like more front facing. So I didn't really read any growing up, which is weird because I love rom-com movies, rom-com shows, romance. But in my reading life, it just never occurred to me to read them. I've read Jane Austen, of course, and I've read a couple. Like the last one I read was Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and Crazy Rich Asians. I read Crazy Rich Asians, but I really am not well versed in romance novels, which is why I'm genuinely really excited for this conversation, because I want to be a part of the conversation, and I just I'm a little overwhelmed with like where to start, because there are so many romance novels right now, and it just feels like every single one, people are like, you got to read this one, you got to read this one. I'm just like, all right, I'm just gonna be buried in this because like I don't know where to start.
That's so interesting because I also grew up loving rom-com movies. Like Sarah, my mom had a bookshelf that was full of romance novels. It was like Nora Roberts and Danielle Steele, and I don't remember ever taking them, but I do remember for a spring break trip that I went on with my mom and my friend and her mom. My mom wasn't thrilled with my choice of reading material for the beach.
Yeah.
I think I was trying to take like a Russian novel like Anna Karenina, and mom thought that was not quality beach material. So we stopped at the Target on the way to the airport, and I picked out a romance novel, and I believe it was a Nora Roberts, something to do with like a winery in California, if I recall. And then I didn't really read much romance after that until I don't know how I started on British romances, like contemporary British romances, where some of them have, they're like the same author writing under different names. So the stories are like slightly different, but they're still romance. I guess some of them are women's fiction and some of them are romance. And then I completely stopped reading romance for years. They were, I don't know, I guess making me feel bad about my life because I don't know, there was like no romance in my personal life, and even I couldn't live vicariously through it because it was just making me sad. But a couple of years ago, I don't know how I got onto it, but I picked up Jasmine Guillory's first romance novel. It's The Wedding Date.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it set off basically like a firestorm, and I have been reading romance novels like religiously ever since, and I can't get enough. Historical romances, contemporary romances, just you name it, I like to read it. It's kind of become a problem.
No.
But a good problem.
No problem.
Like, Sarah and I were talking about this a little bit before, but you know, romance readers read so much that having them as physical books can be an actual problem in terms of like storage space. So it's no wonder that so many romance readers read on e-readers. And
I never thought about it, but yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So our upcoming March-April issue of the magazine is all about exploring genre writing, and one of the articles talks about satisfying readers by giving them what they want and expect from the particular genre that you're writing. And then another article, I think it was in January, February, talked about why readers love genre-related tropes, and that a lot of it was to do with knowing the outcome and the certainty of what you're going to get from that book. And so this ties into my next question, which is, why do you think readers love romance novels so much?
Well, it's hard to speak for everyone, but for myself, romance has such a quality of comfort to it. And some of it is what you said about knowing what's coming. You know, it's not going to surprise you with a sudden major character death out of nowhere, that kind of thing. but I think for me, some of that is because it has such a power to direct my emotions. If in my real life I'm having a difficult emotional time, or I'm just upset or having a bad day, I don't think there's anything else that can more quickly redirect my emotional state to something more pleasurable. It just has that power, a really well written romance, to suddenly whatever's going on in the real world just goes away, and I'm pulled into emotionally centering on what's happening with the story and these characters, and it's very immediate. Whereas something like, if I'm reading a big fantasy novel, I might have to read 100 pages to get really pulled out of the real world and into it. But in a romance, it's almost instantaneous for me. And so it almost is something that I could reach for in the little in between places in my life, just as a little pick me up. And I think a lot of people do use it that way. If you're standing in line and you have it on your phone and suddenly your day is a little bit better. And I think that can really be something that becomes just kind of a lifelong habit.
Yeah, I think for me, romances are sort of like a cozy mystery where you've got like this safety net under you that you know that anything can happen between the beginning and the end of the novel, but at the end you're either going to have the suspect will be known, like who the murderer was.
Exactly.
In a cozy mystery, in a romance, you know that the two main protagonists are going to end up together, and they're going to be either happy or at least like cautiously optimistic together as they head off into the sunset. And there's something very nice about being able to read something and know that while anything can happen in the middle of the book, like that at the end it's all going to come together, and that's really nice and comforting to know. Unlike real life.
Yes.
Totally.
It does kind of feel like the epitome of that saying that it's about the journey, not the destination, because you know the destination, you always know it. It's going to at least happy for now, if not happy ever after. But what matters is how they get there. And I completely agree with you. There's something that's, especially when real life can be so uncertain, something nice about that.
I think it's I think it's like two things. One, the comfort in the structure that any genre, but in this case romance, offers, and that kind of what you were saying earlier, Amy, just like the endless amount of options within the genre. It's not I don't feel like it's anyone can really say romance isn't for them, because there are so many. If historical fiction is for you, there is historical romance. If there is, you know what I mean? So it's not, there's just such a broad range of choices within romance. And then, the journey, we were just talking about this with another genre, my husband and I, but how, with romance, like picking it up, I know that they're going to be together in the end. A murder mystery, like you said, Robert, I know they're going to solve it in the end. It's just a matter of, did I enjoy the experience of getting there or not? And that clicked with me very, very recently, because the first time I started reading romance, I was kind of just waiting for, I don't know, maybe like the contemporary fiction or literary fiction or magical realism part of my brain, because those are like the kinds of books I tend to go to. I was waiting for something, and then it didn't happen. But like, that wasn't, I was like, oh, this is just delightful. Okay, like now I can get on board and understand it better. And then hearing people who are have way more knowledge of this than I do tell me, like, that's the point, is the calm that it offers, has helped wrap my brain around it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that kind of the what you were saying about the journey. We know where we're ending up, but it's the journey, the in-between part that makes the story compelling and interesting. That's why, that's part of why I love it, because I want to see what kind of obstacles are these people going to overcome. And often they're, the romance novels that I've been reading, they're legitimate obstacles. Like, I'm trying to think in real life, how are you going to make this work? And, somehow they do. They go to great lengths to make it work, but it makes real life feel not quite so harsh. you know, you've got these real life situations in your own life that, you know, can present challenges, but just you'll find a romance novel that will show you, like, demonstrate how people have made this work, even if it is in a fictional world. But also, I think that journey, that in between, is what I appreciate so much about romance writers, is their ability to keep us reading even though we know the ending.
Totally. That's hard.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
Yes,
Like, I can't
agree.
think of yeah, how do they do that? And for me, I think it's the tension. You know, they
Oh, sure.
I think romance writers are just brilliant at writing tension. Because, well, there's the sexual tension of whatever romance there's going on, but then they have these ways of building in, like I said, those obstacles that are, how are they going to figure it out? Who is this accidental other love interest, and are they going to, you know, get in the way? Then they figure it out.
I don't want to say too much because this is coming up in a article, but kind of what you're saying reminds me of something that an author recently said to me, which was that it's hard to write a good romance novel, and even bad romance novels are so carefully constructed because it's a form that is really unforgiving, and that flaws show themselves a lot easier in romance novels because there's just nowhere to hide. And I think people have a weird sense that writing romance novel maybe is easier because there is a formula or a structure that you can follow, but keeping readers engaged is has to be the hardest part.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really unique to the romance genre is, I think comparing it to a cozy mystery will help make this point. When you're reading a romance, you want to emotionally experience the journey the characters are on as they go through it. So when you're reading a mystery, you're not necessarily thinking, oh, I really want to feel what it's like to be investigating this murder. Maybe you do, but I don't. But in a romance, you don't always want to just feel the happiness of the ending. You want to feel, what does it feel like to have, be in this new relationship and not really know what the other person thinks yet. Like, give me that emotional experience. You have to, it's like you said, they're so carefully constructed. That emotional journey has to be so meticulously ordered, or it's not going to feel genuine, and I think that's something that's just so particularly unique about it. Like, it all builds on every single emotional shift, and you have to go through every step. In the fan fiction world, we would call this like a slow burn, right? You can't skip to the feeling of happiness at the end. You have to build it piece by piece. And that's something I hugely admire of any romance author.
Yeah.
Well, so that is another, you bring up the topic of, what are these characters experiencing? And I've kind of seen a divide lately in readers who like romance novels that alternate perspectives between the two main characters, and those readers who prefer that we stick with one character's point of view for the entire romance novel. And I wonder if you have a preference and why. I definitely have a preference.
Well, for
I
me,
think I do, but I haven't read enough.
It really just depends on the story. For me, it's a question like that rarely has like a black and white answer. It's all about the execution. Sometimes I'd really prefer to stay in one character's point of view because it leaves an air of mystery of like, oh, what are they thinking? And you as the reader don't know either, as opposed to you're in both characters' points of view and you actually know more than anyone in the story because you're in both their heads. I will say, one of my favorite experiences is when I'm listening to a book on audio and they cast two different people as the two different points of view.
Oh, yeah.
I really enjoy that. It brings kind of another level of realism to the story, especially if the writer is writing them in very different voices. I think that can be really fun.
Yeah, I think that either way can be executed well. I tend to favor like the one perspective for the same reasons Sarah mentioned, with this air of mystery of like, I know how this person feels, but how does the other person, like what's their motivation, what's their intention? And usually, there's maybe a couple suitors involved, and you're not sure which ones. Well, sometimes you know which one they're going to actually end up with, but you know, trying to parse through, like, what's the motivation for these other characters. However, like, sometimes that, like, knowing that other perspective is helpful, like in a Hitchcockian type of way. Like, in the thing I love about a lot of Hitchcock films is that halfway through the film, you know the kind of twist, and then it's a matter of,
Sure,
like, the two motivations. It's a matter of how do we get to the finish, and how do we get to it in a way that's satisfying as well. So sometimes, like, that can be a nice thing about having the two different perspectives. Is, okay, I know how this person feels, I know how that person feels. There's this obstacle. How are they going to get around it?
yeah, I think, yeah, even almost like Gone Girl too, like figuring out here, getting her perspective when you get her perspective is so exciting in Gone Girl. With romance, with what I've read, I think I prefer one perspective. But again, I agree with what everyone's saying, is that it really just comes down to like the execution of it. If someone did 2 or 3 perspectives well, I don't think I would even question it. But I think that particularly with romance, let's say Pride and Prejudice, I can't imagine that book being as effective knowing Darcy's perspective, because the point is that there's endless miscommunication happening, and that is part of the tension that we've been talking about with what makes romance so good. So I do just think if the story itself suggests that it would make it stronger, then like, I'm all for it. But I in my habitual life, I think I prefer one perspective.
Yeah, I do think that like what you said, when there's a story that like centers around miscommunication, if you are getting both perspectives, it's almost frustrating because you're like, just talk to each other and this is fine,
Yes.
It almost makes it worse.
But that's why that's why I love the 2 perspective romance novels, because when you see that, like,
the miscommunication,
when you see the miscommunication and you understand why, the thought process of the person who is, whichever person is speaking, or whichever point of view we're getting, when you understand why they aren't responding or talking to the person, or why they back off and stop communicating, or whatever it is, I love knowing their motivations behind that.
What's that called? Is that dramatic irony, maybe? Like, we are in on it and they aren't?
Know. Maybe.
Anyway.
I don't
Well,
I don't have my literature book here. Yeah.
This is not a romance novel, but it is, well, I don't know, maybe, is there such a thing as a literary romance novel? Because you saying that, there is a book with the most heartbreaking dual perspective tension that I've read in a long time, which was in Normal People. In the moment, I don't know if everyone's read it, so I won't say too much, but there's a moment where one character doesn't know, obviously, that they're miscommunicating, and believes like this is why the relationship has ended, and this person had no intention of the relationship ending, thinking that this person ended the relationship, and it like results in just a truly like heartbreaking situation that felt too real and very effective, because like I could sense what they were both thinking, and maybe because I was so third person omniscient that like that helped, because I wasn't getting like how they felt in the visceral sense, just more like literally this is how they felt. So I don't know, it is complicated. Again, maybe it's just down to like how the author decides to do it.
It's an interesting question. What you bring up is there such a thing as like literary romance? And I would say some books would certainly count for that, but it is that question of, there is a difference between a romance novel and a novel with a romance in it that doesn't have to adhere to the same strictures. Like when I was preparing for this podcast today, I was looking through some of my favorite romances, and one of the authors I came up with who I love so much is Sarah Waters. But I can't call her most of her work romance novels because they don't necessarily have happy endings, which is
right.
that's just going to disqualify them.
A
They
hallmark.
have great romantic content, but they don't follow that structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's what I see on Twitter, on book Twitter, publishing Twitter, almost on a daily basis, is there is a difference between a book that is a romance that has the happily ever after or the happy for now, and the book that has a storyline that has romance elements to it. But they are, he said, two different things. But now I really want to think about literary romance novels.
Okay, may I say a few?
Yeah.
My favorite book of all time, Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff, is a book about a romance, but it is not a romance novel. I mean, it is heartbreaking and wild, but that it keeps coming to my mind because we read it for book club, and my friend who suggested it read it, in her description I thought it was a romance novel. So I was like, my point being that that's how close yet different they can be. Like on paper, this would be a romance novel, but then in practice it isn't, because of what Sarah said. Like there are rules in place when writing a romance novel that, like, if you don't do them, then it just disqualifies you as a romance novel. That one just immediately came to my head. Another one was there and it's gone. I don't remember what it was.
It's not just about the ending. There's more to this, because I think the other element is that to qualify as a romance, it has to center that relationship as the most important thing. There are some great romantic storylines, subplots, elements in other works, but if it is not the core of that story, it's not a romance. It can't be, that. And I think that affects so many of the other things. That shift changes so much about, like, your writing style and how much time you dedicate to each piece of the story, how much time gets devoted to the character development versus the plot, for example, is just different. And I think it's something that it's kind of like when you read a lot of romance, when you see it.
Totally.
You just get very accustomed to those conventions. Which I think maybe sometimes for someone like you who's kind of newer to reading them can sometimes be a little, it takes a little bit of an adjustment, because it's not necessarily what you're accustomed to seeing in most other genres.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And this isn't a literary reference, but like The Nightmare Before Christmas, like I think that's like got such a good love story between Jack and Sally, but like it's not a romance. It's about Jack finding himself and all that, even though like they end up happily together and all that stuff. Like it's if a book did the same thing, it wouldn't be a romance. It would be more of a finding yourself type of novel, I guess, or story.
Yeah, and I got an advanced copy of a book a few years ago on NetGalley, and it was billed as a romance. And so I read it going into it thinking I'm going to get a happy ending. And I got like my progression at the bottom of my e-reader was getting very, very close to the end.
Oh, no.
And there was still like no sign of a happy ending. And I was like, I don't know how they're going to pull this off. And sure enough, like it was not. There was no happy ending. It was not a romance novel. And I thought, boy, this is not going to go well for the author. If sometimes publishers choose a classification for a book, then the author would maybe choose something different. So I used the little comment section on NetGalley and I said, well, this is not a romance. If this had been billed as like women's fiction or contemporary fiction, I probably would have given it 5 stars.
Wow.
But because it was billed as a romance, I really wanted to give it like 2 stars.
Wow.
Because I could, but it was frustrating. And I thought,
I think that's significant.
The publisher needs to know that when they are presenting something as a romance readers are going to expect a certain kind of ending. And when it's not there, and sure enough, I mean, I felt so bad for the author afterward because they did not change the classification of it. And like, I mean, I know Goodreads is a hellhole for author reviews, but it was not pretty. And almost all of the negative reviews are about like, this is not a romance.
Yeah.
I thought I was in for one thing, and this is not that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody likes a bait and
well, I
switch.
mean, going
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, going back to the safety net metaphor, like they took away the net and
Yeah.
everyone hit the ground.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I am not against reading a sad story. I love a sad story that will
Yes.
break my heart, but I have
Oh,
to
yeah.
know that. I have to know that's a possibility going in,
Right.
or I'm going to feel tricked.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because again, if you're reading a romance because you want to, change your mood and have that little bit of joy
Mhm.
in, in a world that's kind of falling apart sometimes, some days, and you don't get that, that's not fun. That is not fun.
Has anyone read How to Find Love in a Bookshop?
No, I don't think so.
That I just forgot, and that's one of my favorite books I've read in the last several years. And you saying like in this broker world we live in, that was like the minute shutdowns started to happen. I had that book. I had gotten it as a gift, and the cover is so lovely. And I was like, How to Find Love at a Bookshop? No idea what this is about, but I have to imagine that I will feel okay for a little while. And it was so good that again, like I forget that these things exist not exclusively, but like kind of have to exist within romance novels. And I am very used to reading sad books, Sarah, exclusively, which is like a problem. And I was again waiting for like the sad thing, but there were sad things in it, and then it ended so happily, but not in a way that actually didn't feel possible or intangible. It was just lovely. Sorry, little wreck real quick.
Yeah. One of the other, prevalent characteristics of romance novels are, the tropes. Romance tropes are there are just so many of them. Pretend dating or enemies to lovers. Those are, I mean, just literally two of
Countless.
tons of them. Are there any that you find personally compelling or that you have seen more prevalent in contemporary in new releases than others?
That's a really good question. I tend to read kind of not in order, so I don't know if I can talk about recent tropes, but I can talk about tropes as a whole. I tend to really love stories about first times and self-discovery. So I'm less interested in stories that are kind of rehashing something that's already happened, like the idea of getting back with an ex. I'm like, well, you already did that. I don't really care. But if it's something where someone is trying a particular type of relationship or a type of kink or something of that nature for the first time, that's really appealing to me. I do love a lot of conflict in my stories, so something like Enemies to Lovers is right up my alley. And I also really tend to prefer something that's like higher stakes than something more on the fluffy side. I have a lot of friends who really just love, and someone works in a coffee shop and somebody walks in and it's just a really sweet little fluffy piece. And I think that's wonderful. And I'm glad that brings people joy. For me, that's not what I want. I want something that is more high stakes than that. So a situation where there's going to be maybe serious consequences if this goes poorly. I know it's not going to, but I want the possibility to be there for the characters. So that's kind of where I land on a lot of the tropes. Really, a first time will get me every time.
That's so funny because I had no idea that our tastes were so opposite in this because one of my favorite tropes is second chance romances where, which, might be part of my life situation, like where you date somebody in high school or you know each other when you're really young and then, you go to college, life gets in the way, whatever, and you reconnect decades later. I really like those kind of romances, and enemies to lovers is another one of my favorites. I think that what you said about the high stakes is really interesting too, because I do love a good like romance with some political elements to it, or Selena Montgomery is a good one, who is actually Stacey Abrams, but her romance novels from years ago, they're re-releasing them, and one is like, I think, Rules of Engagement. I'll have to double check and put the actual title in the show notes, but they're two spies, they're two government spies, but the main story is them falling in love. But there's a whole world of really high stakes of them trying to survive in a spy situation. I like that too.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have like a specific trope that I lean towards, and maybe this is just like not reading as much in the genre, so like everything still feels kind of new and different for me with it. But I do like when there are a lot of hurdles throughout. Like I don't like a romance where everything's just really easy and like I know they're going to end up together, but I want there to be conflicts that come up, whether that's like an external or internal conflict with different characters, where they're where it really feels like they might not end up together, even though I know they are going to end up together. And then another thing, and I don't think this is a trope, but I do like, and this is even whether it's in books or even just in TV and movies, is I'm seeing more and more better modeling of behavior in romances where people are especially as far as it goes with like consent and stuff. And I think there was so much bad modeling, and I like seeing like the good modeling, just because there are so many younger people that read this stuff, and it's kind of like an instruction manual in a way, like how to act with people, what's acceptable and all that. And maybe this is also me as a parent, like I like seeing that stuff, like that there's better modeling out there, and hopefully that just makes better human beings moving forward, more thoughtful human beings. So
well, yeah, I mean, a lot of us, our first experience reading romance was as kids, grabbing them off the shelves, like unbeknownst to most people. So yeah, I think that more clear consent in romance novels today is just not just good, but just important. I honestly am not, again, I don't know a lot about romance novels and all of the many tropes that there are. I know that I like friends to lovers a lot. I have a hard time actually with enemies to lovers. I have a hard time with contemporary enemies to lovers, because these people in these books are so mean to each other that like I'm just like, you kids should not be together. You are mean people, and you need to find someone who you're not mean to. And then at the end, I'm like, I actually don't care that you guys are telling me you love each other, and like, I'm glad you kiss well, but like, no, you guys are mean to each other. You're mean to each other for 300 pages. But I don't know. I would be interested in learning more about them, because right now I would say like Friends to Lovers is my favorite. And that's it.
I do want to speak a little bit to Robert's point on the behavior modeling, because this is something I feel pretty strongly about. I think there is absolutely a place for messed up, toxic, problematic relationships to be represented, and problematic behavior to be represented in these novels, because everybody's tastes are different. And I definitely know that I sometimes really enjoy reading that. Someone who's like, wow, you really shouldn't act like that, but boy, was it entertaining to read. However, I think the big difference between the books I was reading like in the 90s and the books I'm reading now, back then you would see some really reprehensible behavior and then they would fall in love and that it was just kind of all forgiven and hand waved away. Now, if I see that in
Yeah.
a book, I want it to be acknowledged that that was bad or not ideal. You know, put it
Mhm.
in there. People don't always act correctly or perfectly, but like maybe then after you fall in love, have a conversation about like, wow, you really shouldn't have done that. And I'm mad at you about it and don't do it again. You know what I mean? So maybe that's a little bit of a fine line, but I really think there is kind of room for, you know, the darker, the more problematic content. It just depends on how you handle it. Um, because as you said, you know, some people, especially younger people, they are coming to this like an instruction manual. Even if they shouldn't, it's going to happen. And so I just think having that acknowledgement in there is what really makes the difference compared to how it used to be.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think
Mhm.
that's a good point, because it's like any type of novel, like you're going to have people doing bad things, and but it's more about, or saying bad things. But it's different if you have them say bad things and it's like kind of considered, oh, that's okay,
Right.
versus
Hmm.
like somebody calling them out, or right, whatever. And and it's also possible that maybe the bad things happen and they're not called out, but because of the world they're in, everyone knows that it's bad. Like,
Hmm.
Sure.
it's bad because of all the other bad stuff that is happening around them. Uh, yeah, so I think that is a good distinction as well. Definitely.
Yeah, that's I don't know, I feel like there could be a whole conversation just about that.
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, especially because in terms of like, I know even like, um, like the BDSM community has a lot of issues with certain romance novels because it doesn't reflect accurately what it means to be into that, and it's particular books that happen to be very big. And I had never thought about that because that's not something that's on my radar. And when I started seeing news about that, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, like there is more to this than just. It's important to take time on the nuances of these things if you're choosing to write about them, and if you're choosing to put them in your books, then make sure that it exists in a world where we know that this is bad if it's bad.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. I think in romance, it's just as important as in any other genre. If you're going to write about something, you better know what you're writing about. You should do your research. You should talk to
Sure.
people who are in that community. You should, I would fully agree with you that there are certain prominent examples that are just straight up incorrect in what they present. And I think that it does a disservice to the genre to treat that research step with any less
Sure.
seriousness than anything else.
Mhm.
I like that idea of research and it being just as important here. Um, so, with that in mind, what can writers of other genres take away from um, writers of romance novels or from their own reading of romance novels? Michael, you touched on this a little bit with the interview that you didn't name, where the author, um, I believe, like writes contemporary
Yeah.
literary fiction, but sees how hard it is to write a romance novel and the skill that goes into doing it well.
Mhm.
Um, so I do think that there's a lot that writers in other genres can learn from romance writers.
Well,
What do you
I
think?
think we hear this all the time in our Author Spotlight series, and across like a lot of interviews we do, is advice people have for other writers is to read outside your genre. And it's like, that is a number one piece of advice for a reason, and it's because you learn so much from other genres that just help you. Like, I one of my favorite things about romance novels is that they're so dialogue driven, and the dialogue is so good. And I am very insecure about my dialogue, and I don't write romance, and I don't have an interest in writing romance, but I've learned so much about writing dialogue well to put onto my like contemporary short stories that I don't know if I would have gotten if I had just stuck to my like favorite genres to read. Yeah, and in that interview, I had never even thought about it in terms of like, these are romance novelists are mastering the craft of plot and structure. And if you are stuck in where to move your story in any direction, like, then read romance. Like, there is a B, C, act 1, act 2, act 3 that you can really see and study, and then just put upon your own story in a way that is authentic to what you're trying to do.
I have a couple points on this thought of what other authors can take away from romance. One is more academic and one not so much. So excuse my wordiness. I think on the more academic side, romance is where you can find the greatest writing that has to do with character interiority, because in romance, the most important thing that's happening is what is happening within your characters, in their thoughts and their feelings. Because as much as things are happening in the external world, people are taking actions and talking to each other, what matters is those tiny nuanced shifts in feeling. And obviously, any well-written character is going to have a rich internal life, but I think romance does it the best because it's the most important. You know, if those feelings don't shift the right way, you're not going to make it to that happy ending. And so I think that for writers of other genres, even if you couldn't care less about romance, to see the way romance writers write the interior of their characters inside their heads is really helpful, I think, from a craft perspective. It's just so much more prioritized than the external world. And then my second point, this is my hot take for this podcast. Romance writers write the only good sex scenes, period. Because they are the only ones who practice them. And if you are a romance writer and you read other fiction and you run into a sex scene, it is always going to be worse than what you are used to reading, because other authors don't practice it. It is its own skill with its own conventions and its own craft. And I think what happens a lot of times, even in writers I hugely admire, this isn't their specialty, and they get to a point where, like, I'm going to write some characters having sex, and they don't know what they're doing. And it's distinctly lower quality than the rest of their work. So if that's something you would like to include in your work, maybe you should pick up some romance and just see what they're doing, because these are the people that have perfected it. And it's, again, just as worthy of your time and energy to improve your craft in that area as any other area. So that's my hot take.
I love it.
I totally agree with that hot take, Sarah.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many like stories I've read in other genres where like they get to the like sex scene and I wish that they just said, well, then they closed the door and did their thing.
Yeah.
Because
just skip it.
Because what I read for the sex scene is like, is this even, this doesn't even like physically sound like, you know, just where stuff's like, you're killing the story right now. Because now I'm thinking about this instead of what I'm reading.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So like totally on board with that hot take for sure. And also like, you know, like I knew some of these questions that you were going to ask ahead of time, Amy, and for this one about what we can learn from romance, I actually agreed with Sarah as well. I had internal conflict as one of the big things you can really take from romance, because a lot of, you know, like that's the story is the stuff that's going on in the character, and turn it into a page turner without a lot of external, you know, there's always some external stuff happening in a romance, but you're not turning the pages because of that external stuff. You're turning the pages because of that internal conflict that's going on within the characters, and them, you know, trying to navigate and get to that happy ending. And romance does that just so well. a lot of times, like I'll hear in workshop that uh, as a critique is like, oh, they're stuck in their heads. Like, this story's not going anywhere because they're stuck in their heads. Well, romance writers are able to take being stuck in your heads and turn it into something that you're staying up late trying to find out, what's going to happen. So I would definitely say like romance is the place to uh, really learn how to do that effectively.
Yeah, and I think mine goes along with that. It's the tension that goes along with the character's interior thoughts and the author withholding from the character what it is they most want. And that tension, like you have to know what the character wants, which is that interiority that you're talking about. But then the romance writers know how to withhold that and create the tension of when and how are they going to get what they want. And I think that is, the romance writers do such a great job of that for me, that I think that's what.
Yeah, and to make it feel so authentic too,
Yeah.
like it's just feels very real and not like, just saying, saying that they want this and they can't get it.
Right.
It really feels,
Now it's time for book recommendations. What are some of your favorite romance novels that you want to share with the world that, maybe other writers could read these and pick up some of what we've been talking about?
Well, I'll go first, just because uh, I don't know much about the genre, but I have my guilty pleasure, and I mentioned it earlier, is the Bridget Jones's Diary. I've actually read it a couple times. It's not. Uh, it is like for all the reasons that I just mentioned. I just love the conflict in the character Bridget Jones, and I also just love the little structure of her diary entries. It's just a really fun way to go about it.
I love Bridget Jones. I will go next because, like Robert, I don't have many. But I also asked my friend Lily, who is a huge romance reader and a romance writer, for some recs, so she gave me a few. And this is boring, but Sense and Sensibility is one of my favorite books of all time, and it's my favorite Jane Austen, mainly because I think it's just so subtle and so funny, and the humor just continues to be funny in a contemporary way. And I reread it last year for the first time in a long time, and I was just cackling to myself. And I also think if you haven't read Jane Austen, it's a really good one to start with because it's pretty easy to follow and super interesting. But my friend Lily suggested, if this is okay for me to do, I know nothing about these books. Sorry if y'all don't like them. How to Fake It in Hollywood by Ava Wilder. Anyone heard of it?
No.
Okay. The Soulmate Equation by Christina Lauren.
Oh, I do like that one.
Which is
one back there.
It's a dual author, right?
Yeah. Two authors.
And then the third was Beach Read by Emily Henry.
Oh yeah. Oh, I forgot to bring in Emily Henry. I love her.
Well, there
books.
You go. The one who hasn't read it suggests it.
Yeah. Good suggestion. Well, what I like about Emily Henry is her romance novels somehow always connect back to books or writing or publishing. So it's also like it's a very personal thing for me that I like books like that where they talk about publishing. Sarah, did you want to go next?
I do. Yes. I'm sure you're surprised. I have some recommendations. I tend to follow authors. I find authors I like, and then I kind of read everything they've ever written because I have very particular tastes. So I will. I brought two today to talk about. First of all, I have to talk about KJ Charles, who is the author who brought me back to reading original romance at all. She's absolutely wonderful. She writes historical romance, and I think the thing that I love so much about her work is that her plots are so good and so exciting. She always has those high stakes that I talked about. And as you know, I'm not a historical expert, but the historical side of it is so well researched and so real as well. So I'm going to recommend two books from her. One is called A Seditious Affair, which is a story that takes place in early 1800s London, and it manages to be very, very steamy, but also center class and political differences between the main characters and also the side characters. And it's such just a brilliant combination of elements because you're very invested in this relationship, but you're also learning about the politics of the time, which were very unsettled, and these class differences, and how can these characters possibly overcome all of those things. In addition, I primarily read queer romance. So you also have, these two men in a time that is not necessarily easy for them to live in. So on top of everything else, they're navigating this and their particular social scene. And she just brings that to life so beautifully. Couldn't recommend it more. The second one I'll recommend from her is called The Magpie Lord, which is the first of a trilogy. She describes it as a Victorian Gothic fantasy trilogy. And in this one, I just love the world building. These books really could stand on their own as fantasy novels, but they do center the romance. So they are more, romance novels than fantasy novels. But they really dip into both sides. And so you come out of it just, in addition to feeling, the way you feel about these two characters who also explore class in a different way. But you're also just dying to see more of this particular magic system that she has built, and where's that going to go? So those two for sure. And then the other author I'll mention is Alexis Hall, who, as far as I know, has no relation to me. And he actually found more success recently with boyfriend material, but I've been reading him for a while, and I'm actually going to recommend one of his older works, which is called For Real. If you would like a good representation of a BDSM relationship, this one is really good. It's really well researched, and I think it really kind of hits the tone of someone who understands what that kind of relationship is about. For me, this story is great because I don't always like trope subversions. Sometimes I can feel like they're not executed very well, but this story features an older submissive and a younger dominant man, and it completely stole my heart. It's just, there's the kink and the age gap are both really explored wonderfully, and it explores themes that I really love, which are the deep trust and intimacy growing between the characters throughout the story. And I also just love Alexis Hall's writing. I think that he is a beautiful writer, and would recommend all of his work, but particularly that one is my favorite. And I will end myself there, and I could keep going.
Well, some of yours connect with some of mine. I also love queer romance, and I don't have them with me, but there were two, and I don't know why except I like politics too. Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston.
Okay.
Just
I forgot all about that. And for 2 years, people have been telling me to read that. I haven't read it yet.
Michael, read that book.
Okay. Yeah.
But also, the other one that I believe I told you to read is Playing the Palace by Paul Rudnick. And that one is just a great rom-com about this guy who has, he ends up meeting a prince, one of the English princes, not like the actual...
Sure. Not Spare.
No, not Spare. Not Prince or Harry or William, but, a fictional British prince and in New York who is they're at the UN, and he has no idea who he's just met, but he ends up falling in love with him and then has some really hilarious interactions with each other's families. And it's just charming and hilarious. Great rom-com. Mm-hmm. The other kind that I do like historical romance. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that I love Beverly Jenkins. I read her pretty religiously at this point. These are a couple of her newer ones. They take place in the West during Reconstruction. And again, very well researched historical romance novels that just really shine a light on a time period that otherwise we don't really hear about in a positive way. I mentioned The Wedding Date by Jasmine Guillory. Really anything by her. I get her books as soon as they come out because of that one. I also have a Christina Lauren, The Unhoneymooners, which I think it doesn't say that it is a contemporary retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but I felt like
Oh.
there were like undertones of that Elizabeth Darcy relationship that I really enjoyed.
Love the cover.
Yeah, well, the Tropical Vacation, so
Yeah.
you can't go wrong with that either. And then the other author that I really enjoy is Sonali Dev. And she came to the novel writing conference, partially because, well, I like her book so much and I wanted to learn from her. But this one is, I think, the third or fourth in a series, also Jane Austen retellings. But this was In Sense and Sensibility. And it features a guy who he's running for governor of California. So again, that political thing.
Yeah, look at you.
A lot of the Jasmine Guillory books have some political connections too. I don't know why that is, but in this one, the gubernatorial candidate falls in love with a yoga instructor, and his family's not too keen on it because they have been, encouraging him to maintain this very serious. Well, he's supposed to be marrying somebody else, but he's supposed to be maintaining this very serious demeanor, and yoga doesn't really fit into that. But yeah, Sonali Dev too. All kinds of good recommendations.
There are so many.
All right. Well, yeah, there are. We'll put the whole list in the show notes for this episode so that you all can find them easily. I know there are some that I'm going to pick up because I haven't read them. And of course I need more books. My TBR stack is, only a few tables big at this point. All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks for having me. Good conversation.
All right, for this episode's writing prompt, even if you don't typically write romance, write a tension-filled romantic scene between two characters in your work in progress. It doesn't have to be a scene that you anticipate will make it into the final draft, but use it to explore their personalities in a different way and to practice writing tension-filled thoughts and dialogue. Explore that interiority we were talking about. Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. Be sure to join us next month when we'll be talking about our first book club pick of 2023. In the meantime, you can always find us at writersdigest.com and on social media at Writer's Digest. See you next time.